Good afternoon, and thank you very much for that introduction. I think for some of you, maybe the 100 gigawatt is more of a nightmare given where you've invested compared to for people like me where it might be a dream. So I thought I would take this look at solar from the perspective that most people approach this topic, which is solar as a religion. Right? So if you talk to most people in this industry, they're either one side or the other. They're skeptics or they're zealots. They're fanatics on one side or they're heretics on the other. And I think solar has always been, actually most parts of renewable has been treated this way. And there's some truth to both, if I can get this thing to work. Or if you've got, How does it go back? Can you take it back one more? Am I pressing the wrong button?
This is next. This is
Oh, okay, it's back. Good. Okay, thank you. Great, thank you. All right, so let's take it from the skeptics and zealots side. So you've heard this many times before. Solar's price has dropped considerably. It's grid parity. It is the answer to all of our problems. It is going to solve all of our power needs. It may even solve world hunger if you give it the chance. But the truth is not quite there. Yes, we have hit grid parity, and I'll walk you through how, and I'm sure the question all of you have is, will we still make money at these numbers? We'll walk through all of that, but it has its limits, so let's keep those limits in mind. Of course, the other thing, and you've heard the government especially talk about this, every rooftop, every village is going to be powered by solar, and we'll be all independent and no longer have to rely on those horrible distribution companies. Right? The truth of the matter is, most of us don't live in the desert, and the desert is where solar is ideal. And because of that, rooftops in villages are not necessarily going to be the best places for solar. So we'll walk through that issue as well. And then you've got the skeptics. Many of them are in this room, I'm sure, who believe that this is too expensive. There was a time when it was expensive, and that's no longer true. However, it's not without its trade-offs. And there are those of you who've invested in Coal India who believe that coal will always be a big part of our future and a big part of the power mix. And I would say it's still going to be a part, but I don't think it's going to it needs to be as big a part as we've all imagined it to be, because the mix can actually shift. And of course, the one thing that everybody worries about, the large land mass is required. Yes, it requires a lot of land mass. Hundreds and thousands of acres to even put up a small plant. However, there is lots of land mass available in India, in the middle of nowhere. 3 to 4%, 5% of the desert, middle of nowhere, nobody's there, there's no resettlement issue, it's non-arable land, and we could provide for all the power needs that we need. So, yes, it requires a lot of land, but frankly, that's not really an issue to worry about. We have enough access to land. So these are the religious approach. You'll have heard a lot of this over conversations, over cocktails. But solar is a business. And so I'm an engineer and a business person, so I'm going to put the skeptics and the zealots aside and just talk about some facts. And then we'll put the facts together and see what does this add up to as to whether this is a relevant business or not. The fact one of dropping solar tariffs. When I started in this business, we were signing solar tariffs in the 16 to 18 rupee number. And we were per kilowatt hour. And it was always relegated to the margin. It's always going to be there. It'll be a small mix, not really a core part of our mix. Of course, a lot of you know what has happened since then over the 4 or 5 years. Tariffs have dropped, and I'll tell you that our company has led the drop in several of those years. We've been treated as pariahs at times. There are some things to note about these facts. First of all, while in every single year when the price has dropped more than people thought, everybody has said that's too low, it won't make money, the plants will not get built. The truth is, the plants did get built, those plants did make money, and they were sold from the initial developer off to new owners at fairly good margins. In fact, I built several of those plants in the first 3 years and sold them at those as the prices declined. So while we look at the new current price tariff at under 5 rupees, and we have the same skepticism, are these going to get built? It's too low cost. The truth of the matter is they are getting built, they are getting financed, and they are making money. And of course, now we've hit that beautiful sweet spot where we are competitive. Solar is competitive now with other sources. There are implications of this, the macroeconomic implications, which I'll leave to you and we can cover in Q&A. But now there's a real question about what does our power mix look like. It's no longer a question of is this a marginal part of our power mix, 3%, 4%, 5%, or does it play a more significant role in our power mix? And that's a question that I don't think we have a full answer to yet, but something that we need to wrestle with. Fact number 2, when I started in this business, there was 20 megawatts of solar capacity in India, which doubled a year later, and we thought that was great. At the end of December, we closed at 5 gigawatts, which looks large, 5,000 megawatts of solar energy. Of course, it's a small part of the 100 gigawatts that we still have to build. So the market is still large, still yet to come. Some of you have asked me, is the 100 gigawatts doable? And that's really one of the questions we're going to try and answer as we get through this. Because the idea of doability has many dimensions to it. There's a technical question, there's a capability question, and there's the big financing question as well. So there's a 100 gigawatt target by 2022. I'll put on the table that I think it's doable. I don't think it's without its problems. I don't think it's without its issues that we have to wrestle with. But there's no physical law that could stop us from getting to the 100 gigawatt number. Of course, now that it's commercially viable, there's also an economic force to suggest that this is the way to go. Of course, the 100 gigawatts within the larger scheme of things, if you look at potential, like I said, only 5% of the desert, and we could cover a large part of our power needs, suggests that the potential in India, if you were to leave the gates wide open, is much larger. So if you look over at the market, even beyond 2022, we're just at the beginning, just at the very early stages of what solar can do and the mix solar could be within the power mix. So even once we get to 2022, there's still a large part of the market left to be built. So this is the horizon ahead. Fact number 3, if you had asked me in September, October, it would have been 16 months after the new government had been elected. And as of that September, October, not a single power purchase agreement was signed in the solar space by the federal government. So despite all the hype and discussions around the 100 gigawatts of solar, in the first 16 months, basically nothing happened. The states led. They in that last year itself have signed 3-4 gigawatts. But then between October and now, the federal government has also stepped in. The solar parks have opened up, the price have dropped below 5 rupees, and you're seeing a lot more PPAs getting signed up. And so there's a plan, and this plan every year as the number of PPAs to sign and roll out is set out. There's a mix that the federal government has. They want so much in utility scale and so much in rooftops. I'll put on the table right now that I don't think that rooftop mix is going to happen. I don't think we'll be able to scale up to that many rooftops, primarily because I don't think the economics really work. I certainly think utilities could be much more than that in terms of space. And we can talk about why I believe one versus the other as we get into Q&A. But the first part of the engine, which is the requirement to have the power purchase agreements set and signed, that process is kicked off and the engine is going quite well. There's over 10 gigawatts of PPA signed in the market being built in the next 12 months. That's 2x of what we've built in our history, being built in the next 12 months. Fact number 4 is about capabilities. And these are the 4, I think, most critical capabilities that our sector has really picked up. The first is, on the top left, is around land. And understanding what land is good land and what land is bad land for solar. The first part of that is understanding solar radiation. For those of you who are technically inclined, different parts, but latitudes matter, and closer to the desert matters, clear skies matter. So there was a lot of data around this that was hyped or wrong in the early years, and we've all learned how to assess solar radiation much better. So we are able to predict the configuration and output of a plant much better than we could earlier. In the early days, remember the first set of plants, they could not produce to the business plan. Right? That's not true anymore. Today, our predictability is much better. The other capability is in acquiring land. So we acquire for any given plant anywhere from 400 to 1,000 acres in one single configured plot. And we've built that capability to be able to identify land records, go through the due diligence, acquire the land, clear title, and be able to clear it and use it. We never have any resettlement issues because this is the middle of nowhere. We never convert food to power, again, because this is non-arable land that we usually convert. So the whole first side of land acquisition, identification, development, connecting to the grid is a skill set that as an industry we've learned along the way. The second is financing. In the early days, all of our financing came from Indian banks, and the questions were, will solar work? Aren't things different in India? It was very hard to convince them that, funny enough, the sun that rises in India is the same sun that rises in the US, so perhaps the data could be transferable. But will it work over a long horizon? Of course, I have 1 billion years of data to suggest the sun will continue to rise in the east and set in the west. So really, you guys have had lunch, and is that what's keeping you out of pocket? So the financing has been a long, drawn process over the last several years, and the banks becoming much more comfortable in understanding how to price and support the sector. We haven't had any NPAs, which of course already sets us apart from most other businesses, but of course it's still young. So the banking sector has stepped up. Project financing, which used to require a lot of guarantees in the early days, today is non-recourse project finance, so that's changed along the way. Rates are very competitive. The third element is EPC. We had very few EPC players in the early days. Today, to suggest that we could build 5 gigawatts is not out of the norm. Typical EPC process takes anywhere from 4 to 6 months to get a plant up and going from basically empty field to commissioning. So it's a very rapid process. So we have the engineering, the construction, the labor skills to pull that off. And that capacity is built up. And the fourth and the last is operations and maintenance. So in the early days, we used to either wash these panels too often or we wash them never at all. And we've learned the optimal mix of how to keep these panels clean, how to manage the wiring, how to manage the electrical components. I was telling somebody that in my first plant, my inverter, which is a very large electrical component, was built inside this air-conditioned room that was more luxury than most people have in their homes. Today we've learned how to re-engineer these much better, so to manage the O&M at a much lower cost and still be able to get the output out. So over the last 5-6 years, slowly as we've gone from 20 to 5 gigawatts, the capacity of this country to be able to build and scale has increased. So these are the facts, which brings me to the question of how do you make money in this business? So making money in this business, as we've discovered in some parts of it was easy, but I think it's becoming much, much more difficult. And there's a reality we have to recognize about solar, which is like most infrastructure, at least some infrastructure. All of the cost is known right up front. It's spent in the first 6 months. After that, we don't replace panels. We have a little bit of operations and maintenance costs, a little blue thing that goes across. We have zero fuel costs. No one has yet learned how to charge for the sun. So until they do, I don't have to pay anything. There's no fuel uncertainty. Yes, there's fuel variability, but there's no uncertainty. Like I said, morning to night, I know how it's going to behave. And I've got a contract. Now, that contract happens to be with a distribution company, and you will have different opinion about whether I can believe in that contract. You'll have different opinions about whether I should think about payment risk. All those things we can factor in. But I've got long-term contracts. I've got long-term warranties. The equipment is warranted, some for 25 years, some for 5 to 10 years. And all the cost is known upfront, the configuration as well as the simulation of how it'll generate output. So it all goes in right at the beginning, and the cash flow is pretty much predictable. This is how the business works. So far, there's been different business models in how people have decided to make money. The first has been the traditional developer route. These are people who will get the contracts up and going, get the land up in place, approvals, financing. So far in the last 4 to 5 years, many of them have made money by arbitraging cost. And while they talk about risk, frankly, there's very little risk on the developer side in solar. It's not like hydro, which requires 3 to 5 years of permitting, land acquisition, right-of-way issues. It's not like nuclear, which may take 7 to 8 years with the contracting issues, liabilities issues. In solar, we have none of those things. Contracting and approvals process is very straightforward. From the time I sign a PPA, within 3 months, 4 months at the outmost, I'll have all the permissions and all the land ready to go in place. However, in the early days, while the tariffs were dropping quite fast, the costs were dropping faster. So People who used to sign tariffs at one price, 6 months later discovered the costs were so much lower that they were able to arbitrage that difference. So they made money by trading contracts, trading licenses, right, within the gamut of the restrictions imposed by the PPA. But that's where a lot of the developer side made money. The other side is EPC, which is our traditional take the EPC margin, design, build, construct. In solar, the EPC provides a wrap, a guarantee on performance that's essential for us to get financing. Now, in a traditional EPC business, if you've invested in the EPCs in India, typically you'll see margins of 10, 12, 13% margins. In solar, those margins have compressed down to 3 to 4%. And you may think, 3 to 4% for an EPC where I've got to give a guarantee, just that can't be worth it. But unlike most other businesses, like building a coal plant with a 10, 12% margin that may take 4 to 5 years, here I'm talking about 3 to 4% in 3 to 4 months. So imagine cycling. So the EPC cycles 3 to 4 times a year, and that's how they'll make their returns. And you can create a very good value business as long as you're on that treadmill of continually turning up the business and being able to move the volume through your books and keep your resources occupied. Model number 3, this is the one that's the most prevalent. I think this is the one that many of you have seen, which is the independent power producer, though frankly I don't like to call it IPPs because, well, everybody's an IPP in this business. But these are the folks who will build a large portfolio, build gigawatts of power, and will continue to reinvest the cash that's coming out to continue to grow that portfolio with the idea that one day, once they get to some magic size, there will be an IPO market or there'll be a buyer to take them out. Right? So I build a plant at 16, 17% IRRs, and I keep building new plants at that level. And one day, once I've got a gigawatt equivalent of cash flow, somebody will buy me out at 14%, and I make a ton of money out of this. A large part of the market is doing this. Several of them are starting to approach the public markets, in the US at least. We haven't yet seen anybody approach the Indian markets, but that may be coming up soon as well. Their exit is based on some sort of a multiple they'll have on the EBITDA or the cash flow. And the fourth model, which is the model that is just starting, is treating this like a utility. So this is not based on an exit idea, but rather to build, own, and run the plant over the long horizon with the idea the cash generated from the business itself, from the plant itself, is returned back to investors, and the cash itself creates the value, and not some magical exit. So now by creating these cash flows, then the value creation here comes from managing the plant really well, but also by refinancing, by finding continual ways of reducing the cost of capital and then returning that back to investors. Yeah? So these are the 4 different kinds of business models we've seen in this business and how to make money out of this. Our business is model 4, so we are a utility. And so we treat this business a little differently than most others, and I'll walk you through my assumptions of this. And then when we have Q&A, you can ask me about what I've experienced in the others. So the reason we've done this is because we have a thesis, which is that once a plant is set up and running, that the residual risks that we have in this business are very low and comparatively lower than most other comparable conventional plants. So for example, yes, with discoms, I have payment delays. Those are factored in. We have marginal machine breakdowns. You have to understand in solar, we have no moving parts. It's not like a wind turbine where there's a gear, or a coal plant or a hydro plant where there's lots of moving parts. This thing just literally sits there. But there are going to be the odd panel that breaks, the inverter module that needs to get replaced. So there's marginal things that happen on the outskirts that need to be watched. There is fuel source variability. So on an odd day, there might be a cloud. However, it's not the same as wind, where the variability could be quite significant. The advantage we have in solar is I can tell you tomorrow with a 95% predictability in 15-minute increments how much power my plant will generate. Right? So that's how good the ability of the solar prediction is in our models. It's unlike wind or unlike most other things where the variability will be much higher, but there's still variability. Beyond that, we have no issue of predictability. We know how the sun behaves. We have no issue on fuel cost or quality. We have no supply chain constraints. There's an evacuation line, but beyond that, there's no other supply chain issues. Some of you had asked me casually about issues on water. We do use water to clean the panels, but the amount of water is so limited that even in the middle of a desert, 2-3 tankers every week, every couple of weeks is all I need. And then environmental regulations. We have all that stuff works in our favor. So in managing these cash flows, the residual risks that we have to manage are actually very low compared to most other power plants. However, the market doesn't price it that way. So we are treated just like every other power source, every other infrastructure source. So we believe there's an opportunity here that by proving that this is actually much lower risk over successive years, that by proving that it is actually lower risk, returning cash, that we can actually arbitrage that risk perception and be able to refinance at successively lower rates. So where do we see this? Our cash flows themselves are built at the worst case, in the event we don't wash or we leave it in the ground, in the 10-12% return on IRR. These are all IRR numbers. We believe that just by running the plant well, and this is whenever we bid for a plant, this is how we bid to get to a 16% IRR on base case financing. That is, Indian debt, at Indian market rates, at Indian leverage for new companies. So you can imagine what that's like if you've talked to a bank. And then, so that's where we bid. So the sub 5 rupee number that many of you are thinking about. So we've won a project in Maharashtra sub 5 rupees. And it's with all the contracts in place. So the way we're structured, we have to have the costing side in place before we bid to get us to that 16% IRR at sub 5 rupees. And likely, we think that there's interesting refinancing options that we're starting to see. Green bonds are starting. There's some changes that we see on the horizon. We can push that IRR up as we refinance it. The ideal goal that over a longer horizon is to treat this like a fixed income instrument. If I can treat it like a pure fixed income play and demonstrate low risk, we think the ability to arbitrage that risk out is much more significant, like a true utility. So this is where how we see value creation out of the utility play. Which brings me back to this. I started by saying this is not about religion, but at the end of the day, all the facts and figures are right. And where you put your money has a lot to do with what you believe, which may be a religious statement. Right? So you may want to think about developers. And so here the question is, do you still believe that there's still an arbitrage that's worth the risk? So there is still risk in buying land ahead of time. There's still some risk in signing contracts you may not be able to flip. So that's one side of it. In EPC, do you have a good player who knows how to manage a continuous flow of business, manage their working capital and their resources at 4% margins, and keep turning it 4 times a year to be able to return the value that you need? Yeah. And there are players like this in the market. They're not all of them. There are quite a few who are losing out on this game because they haven't engineered to a 4 times 4 model in EPC. And portfolio. There are quite a few out there. There are many who are starting to come to market. You just have to believe that there is a market out there, that there's going to be an IPO event. There's going to be a buyer who's going to take it out. And the last one, where we spend time, is will we really be able to manage the cost of capital and demonstrate the low-risk nature of solar to get there? These are the 4 different business models that are operating. And at sub 5 rupees, I will tell you that everybody in this game is making money today. So if you're asking me, at sub 5 rupees, can people make money? The answer is yes. It's not true that it's going to be across the board. It's not true that it's easy. It's a lot of work in any one of these spaces. The second question is, do we think that this will then lead to a fundamental shift in the power mix? Frankly, we're at 5 gigawatts. If we get to 15, 20 gigawatts, that gives us good breathing space from my perspective. There is a larger question somebody asked me at break, which is, doesn't this change the way we as a country would think about where we would put our money? That's a macroeconomic question. I'm happy to debate it. I personally think that solar is absolutely the right way to go. It doesn't solve all of our needs yet. If you were to project out 2, 3, 4 years, and it doesn't take much longer than that, there is tech that is going to come out that will allow me to deliver solar 24 hours a day. And it'll be able to hit price points in the 6 to 6.5 rupee number, 24 hours a day. And when I talk about these tariffs, these are flat rate tariffs for 25 years. So this has no inflation, no cost escalation built into it. Right? So that's on the horizon. Now, does that change the way we may think about our power mix? I think it would, and I think it should. These are all the questions that come out of it. Now, do we have the capability to build out to 100 gigawatts from here? Yes. The biggest stumbling roadblock that we have is access to finance. So 100 gigawatts, roughly $80 to $100 billion in the next 6 to 7 years. You're all much better placed than I am to tell me if that's available to be spent in this one space. But it comes down to not a religious discussion about is it good or bad, because I think that part is over. Now it's a question about what do you believe is going to be the value creation lever, and that's where I think the money will get attracted. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was an enlightening presentation. Let's have some questions from the audience. I know it's the post-lunch session. Yes, gentleman in the right.
Yeah, I'm Vinay from Kotak Bank. Actually, as you showed that there is immense potential. Currently, we see that all SEBs are under a burden of deficit and they're not following RPOs, and the government is trying to bridge the deficit. Many of them are not buying electricity and are ready for a load shed to avoid building up a further deficit. Under this scenario, why and how do you feel that SEBs would actually take this power up over the next maybe 5 or 7 years? Thank you.
Yeah, so should I answer the questions as we go? Yeah. Okay, so this is the fundamental risk that we face, but frankly, not just us, everybody in the power sector has this problem. The first thing is on RPOs. We don't rely on RPOs. RPOs is at best a moral persuasion, and money trumps morality apparently. So I think the financial situation will be the one that drives this. Now we're at a lower price now than most. There is an incentive built in because we're flat rate power. Right? So if they buy it today, they buy it tomorrow, in 3 to 4 years, we're the cheapest power in the market for that SEB. We're already at the same price at coal, and if you believe inflation, you don't even have to believe that coal prices will go up. Assume coal prices stay exactly the same. There's a lot of other consumables and labor that goes into a coal plant, which we don't have, which will necessarily drive the operating costs and therefore the tariffs up. And therefore, we'll still be the lowest price coal. So I have a payment risk with SEBs. That's the reality of it. So does everybody else. The advantage over time is my payment risk becomes less and less because I'm the cheapest power in the market. Right? So that's what will do it. Now, at the end of the day, SEBs have to get restructured. SEBs, we have to go through this exercise to solve this problem. To date, we have not yet had a single payments problem. We sell power in Gujarat, which is the easiest one, of course, in Rajasthan, now in Telangana, and in Andhra. You can see from my list, I've stayed away from the most popular states. But some of it is a little selective. It is a risk. But
do you need to be politically connected to sell power to these states?
To be politically correct?
Do you need to be politically connected to the powers that be?
Politically connected. I can only give you a couple of anecdotes. So the Telangana contract that I signed and I'm building, I have not yet met a single politician or official to date. The same is true in Maharashtra. The same is true in Rajasthan. And the same, well, in Gujarat, of course, it was very early, so there were only politicians signing contracts. But this is a very open market to sign contracts. That's not the issue. There are local issues, to be candid. I have to build a 5-kilometer evacuation line or a 20-kilometer evacuation line. It goes through somebody's farmland. There's right-of-way issues. These are all practical issues at the ground that we have to deal with. But politicians, I've never had an issue.
And what you're saying sounds too good to be true. Is there anything that you're keeping from us? Any
too good to,
dirty secrets about solar that you're not telling us?
Why is it too good to be true? I wish you'd been here 4 or 5 years ago.
It's cleaner, it's cheaper, it's predictable.
Yeah. Well, look at it this way.
SEB
4
should
years
be buying
ago,
from you.
4 years ago, it was cleaner, popular, and expensive. Today, at least, I'm cheaper. So It's taken time to get here.
All right. I'll just come to you. Can we, the mic? Yeah, you already have the mic. Go ahead. Go ahead. If you have the mic, go ahead. I didn't see you there.
Yeah, it's okay, thanks. Hi, could you give me a sense of the changes in the technology ecosystem that has resulted in such steep drop in power costs, point number one. And secondly, what's the status of the 10, 15 rupee plants that are up and running? Are they, I mean, obviously they're not viable from a technology point of view, but economically, do SEBs still draw power from them? What's the financial status of that?
So to date, the 15, 16 rupee tariff PPAs are still being paid out. So there was a case about 2.5 years ago where the Gujarat Discom went to GRC, the regulatory commission, to get the PPA price changed, and they were rejected, both the GRC and as well as APTEL. So the PPA price has been honored to date. And technology is an interesting question. So for any plant that is already built with a contract, technology change is irrelevant. All you're worried about honoring the contract, right? Because just because a new plant is being built at a different tech doesn't matter as long as my contract is getting honored. So we don't worry about the old plants in terms of tech. We worry about the old plants in terms of contracts and honoring the PPA. Now, you asked a question about how the pricing is coming down and tech changes, right? You know, this is not like, well, how would I say this? It's not some magical technical shift. It's not like we went from, stone knives to, electric machines. We've had 2 or 3 big changes in terms of commodity pricing. So the base material that goes into making silicon PV modules and then the manufacturing capacity of modules has changed so much dramatically that the price of those has dropped by almost 80% in some cases, right? And they continue to drop. Now, the question with those folks is people are asking, are they still making money? Frankly, we buy from China, and the top tier players in China, their quality is exceptional. If you're careful about how you source, I'm happy to talk later about how that happens. And they're making money at the prices that we're talking about. And there's continual incremental changes in that. I do think that what we don't talk about is how much engineering changes happen because of India. So today we built a plant here at like $750,000 to $800,000 a megawatt. The exact same plant, using the exact same components, costs $2 to $3 a megawatt $2 to $3 million a megawatt in the US. And labor component is a significant part of this, right? Materials are a big part of this. We've learned a lot about re-engineering the design. We've learned a lot about re-engineering the structure that holds it. I gave you the example of the fancy air-conditioned room I built for the inverter, right? Like it's some holy god or something, right? And today we leave it outside under a shed. I mean, these are all changes that we've learned in running, building, and operating these plants to understand what it will take to keep these going. That's actually been a bigger shift than the initial. The price drops all happened in the first 2 years. So you saw that steep curve. Everything else has been this shift in re-engineering.
Go ahead.
Well, 2 questions from my side. Basically, when you talk about the 4 business models wherein you're seeing still players are making money in that, so is it safe to assume that only foreign players are able to make money because they have access to cheap sources of funding which are linked to LIBOR? Or do you think even Indian players would stand a good chance to make money in that? And secondly, if we scale up to 100 gigawatt, let's say on a pan-India basis, then does India have sufficient transmission capacities to take care of that?
Okay. So the first one on, is it only foreign players making money? So we're a full Indian player. We're an Indian company. All of, our returns are in INR, unfortunately. Our financing is from Indian banks at Indian rates at Indian tenure. So we're making money in this. However, you'll have seen the 2 big numbers that came out. One was the 463 number, right? Everybody heard that, right? Sun Edison and SoftBank. And then 434, which was Fordham. It sounds like all foreign players. Both of those contracts, or all 3 of those contracts, were in solar parks where the land was fully set up and given by the government, where a foreign company coming in, and for the first time in at least 2 out of the 3 cases, didn't need to go through the whole development phase, the risk of buying land, worrying about evacuation. And so they were able to say, look, all we have to do is build it and run it. And for them, zero interest, negative interest rate out of Japan, it was very good. It blew us all out of the market. But if you look at what happened after that, when the bidding happened outside the solar park, not one of them competed, because the whole idea of development is a strange animal for them. We've built a capability of doing it, so for us it was very easy. So we were able to compete in that area and win. So when we talk about sub 5 rupees, I'm still about 10% higher than most of those guys. And so that part is true. On the transmission infrastructure part, transmission is, so we're still small, 4 or 5 gigawatts. The point you make is absolutely right. I think, to your earlier question about, is there something that's too good to be true? It just reminded me, this is a problem that we're going to face. We won't face it the way the wind folks face it, because unfortunately in wind, with such an unpredictable resource, you get these massive shifts in frequency, as the wind comes up and down. We won't have that because we're a little bit more predictable. And I can put current smootheners on my plant very easily. I think what you'll see is a shift towards scheduling. So I told you about 15-minute increment scheduling next day. That has not yet come in. Karnataka has started to talk about it. And I'm hoping more people will, because then it gives us longevity before we face the issues on the grid. But that will be an issue that we'll have to deal with.
Just one last question, if I may, that Sun Edison is targeting to go to, let's say, 3.5 rupees per unit in next 2 to 3 years. Do you think you can also achieve that, or is it just a thought process?
I always say, whatever Sun Edison do, I can do better. But 3.5 rupees. I'd say in 2 years we'll be sub 4. I'm not. I mean, I can see a horizon and a window to get to sub 4. So the next question is, I actually don't think we need to get to 3.5. Right? So even if I can get a cost to get to that, why would I price it at that? And what's the point? If the rest of the power is at a much higher, why am I leaving all that tariff out there? So I can get to sub 4. Even if I could, I won't get to 3.5.
A gentleman in the back.
Yeah, I thought you would really address some of the critical areas which the industry is facing. And it seems you have just bypassed the entire issues. Today, there is a fundamental problem which we are seeing in the solar industry. As you rightly said, we are too small. And if you specifically refer to the grid-connected power plants, the moment we go up to 10 gigawatt or 20 gigawatt or 30 gigawatt, we today don't have the capability in the country to manage the frequency risk. The solar industry can't manage this 15-minute interval risk the moment you go twice, thrice from here. Leave apart going to 100 gigawatt. We are only talking at a talking stage about creating separate transmission capacities for renewables. So today, wherever we are at 5 gigawatt, it's too small compared to what we have a national generation capacity. So it doesn't make a difference whether the transmission line is free for you or you are not, the industry is not paying any transmission charges. But the moment you go up significantly and you need to transfer power from one state to another in solar, and obviously it will not be free for long, and you will need to manage the grid discipline. You can't break that. So in that circumstance, and considering one more fact, that you are banking about a good IRR only on the fact that you have a PPA with the DISCOM. I'm not talking about whether the DISCOM can pay or not. I'm talking about the fact that you don't have a must-run status for solar industry as of now. And I wanted to ask you also, does your PPA have the must-run status?
What was
the must-run power plant status. So if an SLDC in a particular time of the day when you are generating power and the merchant tariffs are significantly lower, does not buy your power, would you get paid for that?
Right.
So
Okay.
if you include those risks, the moment we go up significantly from here, it's a perfect recipe for disaster is what I see.
Right. Okay, so let's take both these questions separately. So as I said earlier, as you scale up, this issue about the transmission grid will become a problem. But the question is when. The advantage that solar has is that the solar resource is more widespread across the country than either hydro or wind. So wind has certain corridors. And when you concentrate that much generation capacity in a small corridor, then changes will affect that part of the grid very quickly. We saw that happen in Tamil Nadu. We're starting to see that happen in Gujarat and Maharashtra. That's not the same thing in solar. You don't have to necessarily put it all in one place. There are some things happening like the solar park. Rajasthan has gotten quite a bit. But we are very careful about where we put our plants. We look a lot at some spread in terms of managing it. So, wind started to face this when we got to the 15 gigawatt type of number, right? I mean, solar, we may have the luxury of waiting to 25 because we're more spread out. Certainly before 100. Your point is right. We'll have to face this issue at that point. I do think we have an advantage other than spreading out. I think scheduling will give us an advantage. So the grid has to become smart at scheduling. On must-run, we are a must-run plant. Solar is, all of our PPAs have must-run status. But you should also see, even if they only honor that for 5 years, frankly, at merit order dispatch, so for those of you who know, merit order dispatch is the lowest cost power gets turned on first. So in 4 or 5 years, frankly, even if you do with merit order dispatch, I'll be one of the cheapest costs of power. So I will be turned on, right? So I move from must run to merit order very, very smoothly. The issue on the grid, that is, I think, the big elephant that we have to resolve. We have time to resolve it. We don't have 5 years. We have 2 to 3 years to get through it. And the answer to that doesn't necessarily mean a massive shift in the centralized grid. There are lots of distributed solutions that can solve this problem that are low cost. There are things I can put at my own plant. I don't need to wait for the grid to do it, right? And I can do it within the current economics and pull it off. So the risk is there. It's not as surprising, or it shouldn't catch us as off guard as it did the wind or the other players. I feel a bigger risk, frankly, to the earlier question, of SEB financial stability. That, I think, is the thing that worries me. If you ask me anything that worries me more.
Yeah, go ahead, Srivath.
James, very, very impressive presentation. Couple of questions. One is, when there is genuine open market access allowed for conventional power,
Genuine.
which it is not today, as you
Yes.
know, it's rigged. When it is allowed, how will it affect your economics? That's one. Second, this government came to power on the promise of solar and wind, as it had been done in Gujarat, that they will replicate it across the country. Do you think they're doing enough? What should they be doing if they're not doing enough? Is the recent power bailout package for the DISCOMs, is it good enough? Because for the first time, they've imposed a hard budget constraint on the states. Or if not, what are the 2 or 3 things they can do which will make life better for solar? Thanks.
Okay, so the first question on open access. Open access has been in the Electricity Act since, 15 years? 2003, right? So 12, 13 years. It is, there's very little of this. It's ineffective. As you said, the local ERC, local politicians always get engaged inside it, and the market is just completely mucked up. I would love for that to get solved, because frankly, it will also help the grid question the gentleman asked earlier. As soon as I go into open access, I'm forced to provide predictable and stable power because it has a follow-on impact to my customer. So the economics are inbuilt for me to provide a stable power into the grid. And so that's a much better way to go. Of course, solving the economics and the stranded assets question is not easy. And I would love for the government to spend time on this. So to roll into your second question, this is an area that I would love for them to spend time on, open access. I think this RPO REC mechanism, frankly, is dead. And there are some very creative things you need to do with RECs. But frankly, if I'm competitive, what's my argument for RECs? Right? So I just need a market with which I can compete directly. So I would not spend too much time around that. I certainly think the grid stability and how we're going to address that is something that they should be spending the most time on right now. Certainly the Uday package and others are very good, and we need to get those things done and put behind us. They increase confidence. I haven't walked through the full impact of that or whether that will solve all of my concerns about SEB financial health. But certainly that's a good path. But that grid stability and how do you schedule across the entire country, think through a mix of hydro and solar, wind and biofuel, biomass and gas. If you have a mix, the ability to manage stability is so much easier, but you need a grid that's far more intelligent. And it's not that expensive to solve that problem. It's a big data management problem. That's where I'd love to see some effort put in. Because the pricing is where it is, frankly, contracting is fairly straightforward. Now, I know I can contract and sign and build these things, so that's not the hard part anymore.
I'll just go to him and I'll come to you, Swami. He's been waiting for a while. Yeah, go ahead.
You were skeptical on the rooftop solar aspect. So just want to know what are your thoughts on why rooftop solar will not work out? Secondly, maybe it's related to the first question, is does the acceptance of batteries like the one that Tesla is making, will that be able to generate 24-hour power, and will that increase the acceptability and also say increase the acceptability of rooftop solar because of that? Or it could also take away, so a couple of your answers on the earlier questions about grid, about EVAC. So if there were mini grids that could be done, where batteries could also be incorporated part of that, would that be more like a government thrust and might not need as much, say, private sector participation, but small mini grids that the government could do in far-off areas using batteries, which would be possible? Would that help the adoption of solar a lot more?
Okay, so lots of questions in there. So let me start with the rooftop question. So the government target out of the 100 gigawatts is 40 gigawatts from rooftops. So the reason I'm skeptical is because of the scale of the number. I don't believe 40 gigawatts of rooftop solar will happen. And it's simply because population dynamics. People do not choose to live in the desert. They choose to congregate and live in areas where they can farm, where we have lots of arable land, where frankly the sunshine is not as great from a solar perspective as in the middle of the desert. And as they get together and live together, they create pollution and aerosols and all the other things that block the amount of sunlight that actually hits the ground. Because of that, a plant that I put into a roof in anywhere where there's a population will typically generate 10, 15% less. And by the way, that is a huge difference, right? Because it all flows to the bottom line. And that means that effective tariff I need would be almost double to make this work. So economically, it just doesn't make sense to me. I would rather put it in the desert and transmit it and still be able to get it to you cheaper. So that's, of course, the rooftop market can survive on subsidies. You give investment tax credits like accelerated depreciation, or you give a direct subsidy. All those things can solve this economic problem, but economically, it just doesn't make sense. There are pockets. So you look at the large corridors like the Delhi-Jaipur corridor, Bangalore-Chennai, great sunshine, large plants, 1 megawatt rooftops. Those kinds of things will work. But these are pockets, right? So you'll find these around Pune. And so you find several of these pockets, and those, of course, should be covered in roofs. But we can't imagine that this is going to be like what happened in the US or Germany or any of those places, right? So I don't think that's going to happen. This second question about batteries and storage, so from what I have seen, these are the numbers I've run, the break point is to get to $100 to $150 per kilowatt hour capex for batteries. And we're getting there. So we're about, I think the US number last one I saw was 250, one of the best ones. So in a few years, I can see the number coming down. At that point, if I deliver, let's forget about 24-hour power. What if I just deliver morning peak, evening peak, and stable through the day, which is really what people want, right? And I deliver it to you at 7 rupees flat rate, 6.5 rupees flat rate. That's a great, I think that market will then completely open up. At that point, your idea of the mini grid is dead on. I actually am not a big believer in microgrids. I think that the scale is too small. I think the ability to manage it is too expensive. I think the idea of several clusters of locations coming together to create a mini grid creates greater stability, especially backed up with storage and backed up by a grid. Creates stability for the back-end grid when you have a consumption and a production at the tail end. So that's a great idea. I don't think it needs just the government. I think that's an area where the private sector can play a big role because it's economically feasible. It makes commercial sense to do it.
Last question from Swami.
Given that as soon as the peak demand comes, the sun sets and suddenly solar energy disappears, to get a proper idea of what the cost, in some sense the backup cost, must be taken into account.
Yes.
If you take that into account, this 4.5 rupees would go up significantly.
Yes.
So either you would need a backup or you would need a storage, one of those two.
Right.
If you add that, this 4.5, does it become 5.5, 6.5, 7.5? I mean, we'd like to have some idea on that. The second issue, everything here just seems to be photovoltaic. Is solar thermal dead? Are rival things there? Because I find at least one guy, Prem Shankar, keeps writing as though that is a viable alternative. I'd like to know about the solar thermal. Third, the idea that market people are so dumb that whatever you quote, the price is going to go down and therefore you can sell at a profit. I mean, surely everybody will begin to anticipate that and everybody will begin to bid lower and lower until you get to the point of the winner's curse. The winner's curse is an ordinary reality of human expectations where the excessively optimistic guy keeps winning and ultimately he's going to get into trouble. Is that not going to happen in this industry too? And if so, how can it be avoided?
Let me see if I've a lot of questions. Where do I start? The first question on the balancing issue, the peak versus off-peak. So if we were to add that back, I'll use storage as an example because that's a model I've actually run to see if I were to add storage capacity in to be able to provide for the evening peak and the morning peak and stability through the day because you need both. Then we'll get to a break-even tariff about 6.5 rupees. Yeah, that's roughly what I would imagine. I think it can get to 6 if you give me another 2 to 3 years as the price on storage drops. That's the one side. So I think that full cost needs to take in. The second question was the solar thermal. Oh, my favorite topic. I'll tell you, when I started this business, we started as an EPC and R&D company, and we had one of the largest PPPs with the government to do solar thermal R&D at the Solar Energy Center in outside Gurgaon. And at that time, the pricing on solar thermal was about 12 rupees a kilowatt hour per unit, 12 and a half roughly, at which time PV was at 17. So we were all saying solar thermal is the way to go. And the target of this R&D project was to be able to build it with 4 hours of storage, so basically solve your evening peak problem, and targeting to get to 7 rupees a kilowatt hour. Of course, a few years later, the PV market dropped out from under us, and so even the R&D project to get to this level didn't make sense. I've seen solar thermal technology change a lot over the years. I've not seen it being able to keep pace with the cost reduction. So it's hard for me to say that I don't see a solar thermal tech today that can match a PV plus storage solution for electricity. Having said that, the worst use of power today that we have is electricity to heat. There's a lot of people who use electricity to heat. For that group, this is ceramics players who have large kilns, steel industry, their solar thermal is a great idea because you're going right from solar energy straight to heat without stopping in between. That tech is worth investing in developing, and because then at least you take the electricity load down and you shift to the direct energy use. And the third question was winner's curse. Yes, this is it hasn't happened yet. I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question.
That's a very bad answer usually.
It's a very bad answer. So in some cases, I've led the price drop personally. So I've been at the receiving end of and I've built the plants and gotten away from it. This time I have not. So I believe there is a winner's curse around the corner, especially somebody mentioned the 3.5 rupees. If somebody were to drive it down to that level, everybody else will step back and say, please go ahead. Yes, I can see some of that happening. It hasn't happened yet. So I watch it with caution, but I always stop myself from passing judgment so far. But I watch it with caution.
Right, that brings us to the end. I'm sorry we're out of time. James Abraham, thank you. Thank you for fielding those questions. Thank you for your presentation.